Today, we're building this bare 4BT into a short block. Well, as you can see, the 4BTs come back from the machine shop, and the head got decked, the cylinders got bored about 20 thousandths over, and I had the crank polished and a couple other little things here and there. I'm not going to be able to build this into a full long block today, but we could at least get half of it done and turn it into a short block, so that the next time I'm home, we can finally get it back into that engine bay right there. So, let's get started. So the first thing we have to do is clean up the block a little bit. Now I spent the last 2 days, a couple hours here and there, and I scraped up a bunch of like the paper gaskets that go around right here where the oil cooler is. I scraped off part of the paper gasket that was on the front here where the timing cover goes, and then there was a little bit of RTV left over from where the rear main seal is, and then you have a little bit of rubber sticking around on the tappet valley on the other side of the block. So there's just a lot of little things you have to clean up. I also went through and I tapped all of the holes. I shouldn't say I tapped them. I thread chased them. There's a difference there. And all you professional machinists in the YouTube comments might get mad at me if I said tapped instead of thread chased. So I went through and I thread chased all of the head bolts, the motor mount bolts, all the front timing cover bolts, the rear main seal bolts, and then all of the oil pan bolts. Those are all nice and clean. So the first thing we're going to do now is get to putting pistons together. One quick note before we start measuring our end gap. We want to make sure that when we're doing this process, if you're measuring all the ring end gap for this specific cylinder, that you keep all of those cylinder rings in this bore. Because between bore to bore there might be 1 or 2 thousandths difference, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but each of these cylinders could be slightly different in size, and so we want to make sure that we're measuring the piston rings for each of these separately, and we're keeping them in order. And ideally, you want to measure the end gap for this cylinder, put the piston together, label it, and then move on to the next one. That is the best way to keep track of them. When we're putting together our pistons, the first thing we want to do is check our piston ring end gap. Now, our piston ring end gap is the gap between this side and this side of the piston ring, and when you put it in the piston bore, it's going to squeeze together like this, and it's going to get much smaller. So we need these, which are feeler gauges, and each one of them is a certain number in thousandths. So if I open up to, let's say this one, this is 10 thousandths, or on the bottom it is 0.254 millimeters. And so that is the distance that we can measure with this specific gauge, and there's a lot more of them here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take this is our top piston ring, this is our first sealing ring, and we're going to put it in the bore here. And then one of the things I like to do is I like to grab the piston it's going to be with, and we're just going to put it down. We're going to push the ring down in the bore until we get to about where the skirt is. Now, like I said before, this block has already been machined, and all the tolerances are checked very well, but just to make sure that there's no taper to the bore, you want to do that. Now, this is a turbocharged 4BT, so our top ring needs to be within 16 to 28 thousandths. So we're going to thumb through our gauges here, and we're just going to go through and we're going to check them one by one until we get to the number that fits the gap the best. So we do that one, no, nope. Now it's getting closer. It's this one. Yep, nice and tight. So the top sealing ring is at 20 thousandths worth of gap, which is within spec, and that means that one's good. So then we're going to pull this ring out just very gently. You don't want to mark up the bore, especially after you've had lots of nice machine work done. And then we're going to put this off to the side because we know it's good. Next, we have our secondary sealing ring. And the process is exactly the same for checking ring end gap, so we're going to place it in here. This one actually has a tighter tolerance because it's going to see less of the combustion heat. So this one we are looking for somewhere between 10 and 22 thousandths of ring end gap. And so we're going to check that with our feeler gauges again. We want to make sure that these are all within spec so that we have good combustion sealing in the combustion chamber, and that will retain more power, as well as making sure that there isn't excessive blow-by. I'm just checking these to make sure they're all in spec. If you get new piston rings like this, typically you shouldn't have to file them down, but sometimes it is required. So you do want to make sure that these are all within spec. That way, if they are too tight, they don't start butting up against each other. Ooh, that's perfect. And pinching, and then they destroy a piston, and then that destroys this whole cylinder, and sometimes you have to throw away the entire rotating assembly because of that. This one is at 14 thousandths worth of ring and gap, which is between the spec of 10 and 22 thousandths. So that one is also good. We can pull that one out as well in the same fashion. And we will place it to the side with the other one. And now we are going to check our oil sealing ring. This is the same thing as we've done in the last two times. So we just want to pinch it. This one's a little bit more difficult because if you can see, there's like a little spring in here that's part of the oil skimming ring. So it's a little bit more tricky to get this one in the bore. You're going to have to work with it a little bit more. And sometimes it wants to fight you and it goes sideways like that one did. So just be patient. You don't want to bend any of these because that's also bad. And the oil skim ring sits in the exact same spec of 10 to 22 thousandths as well. So we're just going to give that a good check real quick. And this one is also at 14 thousandths, which is within spec, so we are good to go. Now we're going to take this oil skimming ring out, and we are going to assemble our piston. So now that we've measured all of our rings for the correct end gap, we're going to put them on the piston now. The easiest way to do this is to start from the bottom and work your way up, because if you put the top one on first, then that means you have to put the secondary one over the piston ring, and it just gets a lot harder to do. So you want to start with the bottom up. So we're going to start with the oil skimming ring, and we're going to just very lightly pull this apart. And in here is a section, I don't know if you can see that, there's the spring, and then it stops in the middle there. So you can pull it apart right there, and that'll widen it a little bit, and that'll make it easier to put on the piston as well. So we'll just place this on here real quick. You want to be very careful as to not scratch the piston. So just be very gentle. Some people prefer that you use a piston ring spreader. I don't have one of those on hand, but I've done this enough times that I can manually pull them apart. Another thing that's really nice, at least about these particular rings, is on this side right here, it's labeled up. And same thing on the oil skim ring, and same thing on the top compression ring. They're all labeled as up. So before putting them on, you just want to make sure that they're all in the correct direction. There we go. We have our piston assembled. You just need to do this for the other three. Obviously check your ring end gaps as well, and then we can start putting them in. Now we've flipped over the block because the first step in actually putting our rotating assembly in is putting the crank in. So we'll need to take off of our main caps, pull them all out, and then I'm going to give each of the journals on the inside just a good wipe down, make sure everything's all nice and clean, because you want to make sure your engine is very clean when you're building it. And then we will put our main bearings in, but before that we actually need to put in new oil squirters They do make billet oil squirters. I'm just going to put the standard plastic ones back in, but we have new ones, so we're going to replace them. Then we'll put our bearings in, and then we will drop our crankshaft in. So we've taken off all of the main journal caps, and you want to make sure you keep them in order and facing the right direction. It's kind of easy because there's numbers facing the back side, so as long as you put them in the correct order, you'll be able to tell which way is supposed to be which. If we come back up here, the oil squirters are all loose. I've loosened all of them. You can push them out with a little bit of force, and it's not too bad. So we're going to take all those out, and then we're going to wipe everything down extra clean. So we've taken out our old oil squirters, and we've cleaned all of the main journals, but we want to make sure that before we put the new oil squirters in, that they're exactly the same as the old ones. We're just going to analyze them. They're the same height, they have the same base width, and the squirter size is exactly the same. So we can proceed, and we can put these in the engine. So I've put the new oil squirters in, all of the pistons, and in order to get them fully seated in there, if you have a nice round punch with a sort of a small rounded end on it, you just want to put it on the end of it and just give it a light tap in there. You don't want to put too much force, and you don't want to get something that's bigger than this hole because you might damage it. The bearing might not fit correctly, and you got issues there. So now that everything's all nice and clean, the first bearing I like to start with is the thrust bearing. It goes in this journal specifically. It's machined just a little bit differently than the other ones are, and I think it is the only one that'll actually clear correctly. Yeah, the other ones are just a little bit narrower. So this is the widest bearing in the entire engine, and it goes on the second from the rear journal. So we're going to take it, and we're just going to roll this in here. There we go. Just like the service manual says. We're just going to give it a little push. Make sure it's fully seated in there. And that one is good to go. The other four main journal bearings for the top. Remember, this is the top because the block is currently upside down. This is what the other four look like. They have a nice little ridge in them, and then they have holes for the oil feed, for the oil galley, and then one of these goes to the piston coolers, which we installed before. And so just make sure that you have these ones in the correct position, because if you put the bottom main journal bearings in where the top ones are supposed to be, you're not going to have any oil pressure, and have fun rebuilding your engine again. So we're just going to do this for all of these. Just give it a nice little slide. One final note before we put our crankshaft in is you're going to notice that the hole for the piston coolers does not exactly line up with the bearings that we just put in. That is okay. Some of these holes aren't going to be lined up to begin with anyway, and one of the reasons for that is just that this is how your engine builds oil pressure. So don't be alarmed if these holes are not necessarily lined up. It's designed to be like that, and you can move on with the process. Alright, now before we put our crankshaft in, we are going to put some assembly lube on each of our main journal bearings, and this just helps the engine protect itself while it's building oil pressure for the first time. It gets washed out after the first couple of seconds of good oil pressure, and it'll be flushed out within your first oil change. But it is crucial because you don't want your crankshaft eating into your main journal bearings and then having to rebuild your motor all over again. The crankshaft is now successfully in, and as you can see, with one hand I can spin it. You want to make sure that this is very easily able to rotate. If it's not, then you want to take everything apart again, maybe check that your bearings are in correctly, make sure your thrust bearing is correct. But this entire assembly, the crankshaft by itself is 80 pounds. You should be able to rotate this with one hand, and it should be able to rotate freely and smoothly. So you want to just make sure that that is possible. Now that we have our crankshaft in successfully, we're going to start putting our main journal caps back on. And remember, we want to put them in the correct order. You want to make sure that you keep them where they need to be. So don't mix them up. So I'm going to start from the front. I've already wiped all these down so they're extra clean. And one by one, you want to just flip them over. And if you haven't already, where'd my rag go? If you haven't already, this would also be a good time to do it. Just wipe them off. You want to make sure there's no dirt or anything. If you feel it, it should be very smooth. So that's good to go. Now we're going to take the other half of our main journal bearing. As you can see, this is different than the other side because there are no holes and there are no grooves. That's the way they're supposed to be. So if you're worried about that, don't, because it's fine. We're going to do the same slide-on technique as we did on the other side. Make sure it's in. Make sure they're centered. And then we're going to flip it over. Actually, before I forget, we need some more assembly lube, because assembly lube is good for your engine. You want to keep it healthy. You don't want it destroying your bearings within the first 30 seconds of it running. So, assembly lube. Use it liberally, but don't get it all over the place. Alright. That's been wiped on there. Perfect. When you flip it over, just very carefully place it down on the engine. I'm just going to tighten these down by hand for right now, because there is a specific torque sequence, and there's 3 steps of torquing them down with 3 different amounts of torque you need to put on them. So for now, we're just going to hand tighten them all so that they don't move, and then we'll come back and torque everything down correctly. Now we have all of the 5 main journal caps installed in the engine, and this is a bit backwards the way I do this, but it's easier for me to remember to do this rather than having to do it while putting the engine together. The service manual recommends that you cover the threads of your main journal bolts in 15W40, just normal motor oil like you would be running in this engine anyway, so you should have some on stock. And like I said, I just like to do this after I've put all the journals in, because I can make sure that they all fit nicely and that the crankshaft still rotates very nicely. So I'm going to take each one of the 10 of these back out. I'm going to just wipe off the threads real good, make sure it's all nice and clean, make sure that they're not stretched or anything like this. These bolts I've already pre-inspected, and they're all good to go back in this engine. We're going to coat all of the threads in motor oil, and then we'll move on to the next step. To fully seat our main journals, we're going to take a rubber mallet, and we're just going to tap on the main journal cap until you hear sort of a clicking sound. It'll change sound when it's fully seated. So, alright, that one's good to go. Now it is time to tighten our main journal caps down. This is the first of 3 steps of torquing. The first one is 44 foot-pounds. And as you can see on the screen right now, we have the torque sequence. So you want to make sure you work in order. And let's get started. The crankshaft is still easily able to be turned by hand, so you want to make sure that that is still possible, because if it's not, that means something's binding up. You're going to want to take it apart and then look and see if you can find what the issue was. Now it's time to put some pistons in. Before installing your pistons, you want to make sure that your piston ring gaps are rotated properly. I have them incorrectly done right now just for demonstration purposes. They're all aligned. You need to rotate them 120 degrees from each other so that the combustion gas has the hardest time of escaping the chamber and making its way into the crankcase. This gives you the best seal, and like I said, you want to have them about 120 degrees off from each other. So I'm going to twist the bottom a third of the way around until it's facing this back corner over here. Then we're going to twist the middle one until it's facing over in this direction, and I'm going to leave the top one there. Now all of your piston rings are set in the correct direction. Before you insert your piston into each of your bores, you want to make sure that they are well lubricated. So we're just going to take a little bit of motor oil on the end of our finger here, and we're going to spread it around. Do this a couple of times. You want to make sure that everything is well lubricated so it goes together easily and it prevents it from binding up on your first startup. So just want to make sure that everything is nice and lubricated. One more thing you want to do before installing your piston is just make sure that all of your piston rings are well lubricated as well. So we're just going to coat them in a little bit of oil. And now this piston is ready to be installed. We are now going to take our piston ring compressor, place it over our piston, and I'm going to hold it up, and then we are going to tighten it with this Allen key type adjuster here, and just tighten it down until the rings get nice and snug. Now that we have installed our piston ring compressor, we're going to slide in our rod bearing here. It's just like the main journal bearings. You want to use the same slide-in technique. Let's move this over just a little bit. That is in perfectly now. And we are going to put some assembly lube on it as well. Again, for when you first start your engine, you want to make sure that it doesn't destroy itself before it builds oil pressure. So we're obviously going to put some of this on here and spread it through there nice and evenly. Again, to be liberal with it but not put too much on. Then, as you can see on the piston, there is an arrow. You might not be able to see that. I'll tilt it like this. There is an arrow and it's labeled front. So you want to make sure that that is aimed towards the front of the motor. And I find that this is the easiest way for me to put pistons in by myself, is to have the engine 90 degrees from being straight up and down, and it makes it the easiest for you to be able to get your hands into both sides and move stuff around and be able to push stuff into place when you need to. So that's perfect. Let me just tighten this up a little bit more real quick. And we can now tap it into place. Doing stuff like this is a little bit harder when you're on yourself, so you want to make sure that you just take your time and don't rush anything, and try and put everything together as smoothly as possible, like that. We're going to come over to the other side. Perfect. And now we will be able to rotate the crankshaft in the orientation we need it, and we can install our journal bearing on the other side. After installing the piston is the best time to tighten down the rod bolts. The torque spec for these is 26 foot-pounds. So we're going to get our torque wrench out, and I've already preset it to 26 foot-pounds, so we're going to go ahead and do that right now. The short block has now been completely put together, as you can see, and it went together very, very smoothly. Just my tips are keep everything nice and well lubricated, and take your time and make sure that everything still rotates freely as you're putting it together. Now that we have all 4 pistons in, it's not going to be able to be cranked over by hand as easily, but it still moves, and that's exactly what we want. One of the tips I figured out afterwards is that if you are unable to get some help and you need to do the 3rd stage of torquing on the main journal bolts, one of the things you can do is you can spin the engine sideways like it is right now, and that'll actually help you get a little bit better leverage on the bolts, because now you're pulling up on the engine and you're able to use the weight of the engine to help you get those bolts correctly torqued. Anyway guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.